So here it is. The last 5 things that we talked about. I'm going to see if I can remember. There's a couple that I probably won't remember, but one is this. Science is not, evolution does not equal science, or it does not mean science. Okay? That was the first point. That's what you should know. That's the first thing you should know. That science and evolution are not the same thing. Science is bigger. Okay? The second thing is this, that it's a battle of worldviews. Okay? So under this realm of science, you have thoughts or worldviews, like what people think. All right? So over here you have naturalism, which believes that there is no God, that matter is all that is and was and will be, that it's even eternal. Okay, but this is what they believe. So because of this worldview, this preconceived idea, this denial of God, they say matter is all we can know. So they interpret science through that lens. Now over here you have theism, or belief in God, whether that's like deism or theism or whatever, polytheism, pantheism, whatever. It's definitely belief in God, and this dictates, when you look at something in science, how you interpret it. You interpret the evidence in light of your worldview. They're guilty of this, and we're guilty of this. Me being a theist, basically, someone who believes that there is a God. We're all guilty of the same thing, coming with our own preconceived ideas. You can say otherwise, but you can, anyway, that's the second one. The third one is this. What is the third one? Let's see if I can't remember. No one remembers? We don't have a God of the gaps. That's right. Man, Faith, you rock. Okay, get this. We do not have a God of the gaps. So oftentimes we get challenged. Think about this in the worldviews, in the realm of worldviews that I just talked about. The naturalists will say, man, the reason that you have God or that you believe in God is because he's a crutch. When you see something in science that you don't know how to explain, you're like, I don't know how to explain it. So you just throw God into it. So they call him, when there's a gap, you throw God. So he's a God of the gaps. Okay? But I talked about the other week that they're guilty of the same thing. And we're actually not. And that never once has belief in God stopped reason and science. And I showed you guys a couple of guys in the past, like Kepler and Galileo, and how they were scientists who were theists, but they made great discoveries. All right? Now, the next thing that I talked about, do you know number 4, Faith? Do you have that? Operational and historical science. Okay, operational science is this, that it's observable things that you can see, that you can test. You can put in a test tube and retest it, and given the same circumstances, retest it. And after like 5 times, you're like, okay, well, this is always going to happen. Therefore, we're going to call it like a law, or like the law of gravity, or anything like that. But that's operational science. And from operational science, you get things like medicine. You get things like cures to cancer and things of that sort. All right? That's operational science. And I talked to you guys that there's a little like wing of operational science that like deals with like morals and medicine and things we can observe right now that like dealing with human fetuses and embryos and stuff like that can be talked about and debated among, and there's probably differences here. But for the most part, operational science is like thumbs up. When you hear operational science, or when you think of science, think, man, that's awesome. I'm all for cures to cancer. I'm all for progress in technology, and I'm all for that. That's awesome. And I think God calls us to do that. Like I talked to you guys at the beginning of the month about, that God said, cultivate the earth. Like Adam and Eve, remember, they didn't have anything. And God's like, hey, the earth is yours. You rule over the animals. You rule over everything. I put you a special creation, and it's yours. And so God is pleased whenever we go out and we investigate and we look and we see God's fingerprints. God is pleased whenever we create things, because that's being part of God's image, is because God created everything. So when you create something, God's like, yes, that's exactly what I want you to do. I want you to subdue the earth, to cultivate it. Yes, to protect the earth, but to use the earth and, a little bit of weighing the both, Okay, I'm not going to get into the environmental issue, okay? Sorry. All right, here goes. So operational science, we're totally down for that. We think that God has called us to do that, and we think that God's pleased. And I think that God's pleased with the last couple of years, all of the breakthroughs in science and archaeology and all these things. And I think that, like Stephen Meyer said, that God is looking in heaven and he's pleased whenever we see like books written by Francis Collins, and that's the name I forgot last 2 weeks ago, who mapped the human genome and the DNA, and he wrote a book called The Language of God. He's a scientist, and he's like, man, I see the fingerprints of God. How can you see all this information in the cell and not see that it's come from God? And he's like, I believe in God. And he's like one of the most well-renowned scientists there is. And he wrote this book, awesome book. And I'm going to tell you something else that he put in that book at the end of this, but it's our 10th point, which is going to be great. Okay? And then the last one after that, historical science is this. You ready? Historical science is looking at past evidence or things in the present that happened in the past. This is where we disagree somewhat, or actually a lot, because if you believe that there's a God and you believe in the scripture, there's obviously things that God has said that you're like, I don't know if that really lines up, And so I'm coming at this and they're coming at, there is no God. This is, so this is, and really the naturalist is guilty, much like we are. I mean, I'll hear the arguments and I'll listen, but I know in my heart that God is God, that God is real, that God, I've experienced God, I've seen it. I'll have smart conversation with you, in your worldview and talk to you about it. That's cool. But there's this disagreement that we have because their science doesn't let room for a God because they say matter's all there is. So they take God out of the equation because you can't put God in a test tube. So we can't even know if God is real. So you're saying that there's a God, but I don't know because all I'm seeing, we can't test him. So science says that, or naturalism says that you have to be able to test something. Remember 2 weeks ago what I said? I hope that when I said that, you caught like the contradiction in their own statement. When they say that, you got to remember they're contradicting themselves because their statement that you have to test everything by science in order for it to be affirmed or confirmed, you have to put it in a test tube. But you can't put that in a test tube. That's an idea that you cannot test. So they're contradicting themselves. And that shows you that there's this preconceived idea of what the world and the makeup of the world is. So that's operational and historical. They interpret the historical science and say millions of years, a lot of chance and a lot of time. And we say, I don't know about that. I see God's fingerprints in the working of the DNA. I see God's working in the fine-tuning of the universe. That if one thing was off by just a little bit, there would not be life here on earth. We wouldn't be. We look at different things like that. And that was the last point. There were 3 words that I wanted you guys to kind of know and look up. The first one, I don't know if it's in order or not, but fine-tuning. It's looking through a telescope into the world and like the universe as a whole and how it all works together. Fine-tuning. The second one was when you look into yourself and you look into the cell through a microscope, you see that there's irreducible complexity, which means all these parts function together and they need one another, and you have a problem in science or in naturalist thinking, like which came first, the chicken or the egg, that type of thing. You're like, I don't know. Well, we're like, well, the chicken did because God made the chicken. So that's not even part of that. But listen, irreducible complexity, fine-tuning, and that last one was one that I learned as well. I forget what it was. Faith? Interdependence, yeah. And that's the scientific term that you guys heard in your textbooks. Basically how every ecosystem needs the other, or, everything working in the ecosystem, the decomposers, you know what I'm talking about? Like that. I'm really not that smart at that, but they need each other to work. So you see these interdependent relationships where this bacteria feeds on this for food, and this organism also needs this thing to take all the bacteria off of it. And you're like, well, they both had to come at the same time, and evolution doesn't really provide for that type of thing. So it's like, okay, so those are just cool things. None of these are like solid, like, booyah, hit you in the face, there is a God. But all of these things together bring a pretty good argument. And the last point that I'm going to make, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, you're not alone. There are other people who believe this. Some people would like you to think that you're alone in these ideas, or that your ideas are dying, that they're dying, like, oh man, it's the age of progress. You can't have these thoughts. You can't really believe that there's a God. People will really say this. Why do I think it's important to tell you guys this? Is because you're going to get attacked by these theories and by these ideas. In college, when you go, you're probably getting it thrown in your face at school. But these are things that you're going to have to deal with. This is why I think it's important to take the time to tell you guys these things. So that's the first 5 things. All right, I'm going to try to go really fast through the next, okay? Here goes. And really, I should have just said what I just said the last 2 weeks. I mean, it was pretty easy, right? Did you guys get all what I said? I kind of zoomed by it. Thank you. Thank you, Seth. What? All right, sure thing, he said. Okay, got it. Okay, number 6. So number 6 in this, if you're taking notes, David will put it up on the board. It says this: the difference between micro and macro, and we'll just go ahead and put evolution. Microevolution and macroevolution. It's good to know the difference between these two, and to know it in your kind of heart. Basically this, microevolution is described as relatively small changes in genetic variation that can be observed in populations. So it's small changes, it's vertical changes in species, and it's little changes that we can observe. And this is going with operational science. Like, we can observe these changes now. Okay, the other thing is this, macroevolution. It's a horizontal change. It's kind of the evolutionary type of thing. And this is where we would maybe disagree a little bit more. It says this: the change from one organism to another by natural selecting, acting on accumulation of mutations over a vast period of times. So because of mutations are kind of driving this, you get changes in organisms. So to be extreme, an ape-like creature turns into a human creature. And these are two obviously separate things, like from a fish to a bird to, so like these are like dramatic changes. And these are changes that we've never seen, and one reason that we probably wouldn't see it is because of time. But this is where we would maybe disagree and maybe fight a point a little bit. We would agree with microevolution, but not macroevolution. That's large-scale changes in organisms. But micro, we're totally for. We see natural selection working. Yes, it's very reasonable that if an animal has fur, the more fur that it has in a colder climate, the more likely it is to survive, and that's reasonable. But does that mean that it, through the period of time, turns into another organism altogether? We would say no. So micro and macroevolution, you can look it up more. I'll probably give you guys some websites at the end if you remind me. Just some cool things to look at. Some really smart guys, really smart women who know what they're talking about better than I do. But, so know the difference between micro and macroevolution. Okay? So listen to this. Number 7, mutations. It's a word I just used. Mutations are never an upward move. Mutations are never an upward move. Natural selection selects from already existing information. So always in natural selection, what we have observed, we see this, that whenever something mutates or there's change in things, that it's never upward. It's never new information, which is kind of what the theory of evolution calls for, is that you have new information, new things coming into being. Like this single-celled organism into a multi-celled organism. That's the kind of thing that's happening, is new information. But in the recorded instances, we don't see that. What we see is that it's always a downward move. Mutation is. It's always a loss of information. It's never a gaining of information, and that goes against everything. So I have this quotation. I have two quotations. Mutations are not able to add new information. That's the first one. The second one is this. Not a single mutation has ever been observed to cause an increase in the amount of information in the genome. That's a pretty good point, guys. Because mutation is the thing that drives this theory. But never once has it ever been recorded that we see new information added. It's always a loss. That's the seventh thing. The eighth thing is this. The difference between common descent and common design. If you guys have been in science class, you've heard this, that Darwin's theory of common descent. Basically, we all came from one organism, every living thing on Earth, or living organism. So basically coming from one single-celled organism and so what you see is that, man, we all have, just like a monkey or a fish has eyes, man, we all have eyes. Why is that? Well, you look back and you see this, we come from a common ancestry, or just because we have common things in our genetic makeup, they're like, see, that proves that we're the same and that we came from the same place. And that's common descent. But what I'm saying is I'm bringing a new word into this. It's not a new word. It's been used plenty of times. But think of it as this, common design. So the example I like to use is Thomas Kinkade. Have you guys ever seen a Thomas Kinkade painting? Man, yeah, it's awesome. When you look at a Thomas Kinkade painting, there's one thing that you can know. You don't even have, all you have to do is look at two of his paintings, and you can know what the other hundreds look like, basically. If you look, you're like, I bet that's a Thomas Kinkade painting. Why? Is it because each painting came from the same paint that he used? Or that each painting, evolved from one another? No, it's because you see that it was a common designer. The person who made it is the same guy. And he is like, these are his ideas. Like, okay, this is my idea, I'm going to put it in here. And then what you see is this creator's fingerprints on the painting. Not his literal fingerprints, but you see his personality. You see his characteristics when you look at these things. You see a little bit of, you're like, I know who painted that. It's like poems or writings. You can tell your mom and dad's writing most of the time. If your mom or dad wrote something, or whoever it is, brother and dad, or sister and dad, or sister and brother, whoever it is, if you got two friends that you know, guess what? And they write you a letter. They don't even have to sign their name at the end. You know who wrote that letter if you've seen that enough. Because you've seen a letter in that form before. So this is common design. And this is what we see in creation. We see a lot of similarities, but none that are from common descent, but rather a common designer. Like, oh, that's God's idea, That's great. So there's a word, it's homology, and it's the study of similarities in organisms. Like you've seen, like in the textbooks, like a winged bat arm and a human arm, and the similarities. And the evolutionists are like, see the similarities in it. Well, that's an assumption. Just because they look alike doesn't mean that they are alike. I mean, or that they came from the same place, but rather it points to a common designer, just like an automobile. You see cars have the same makeup, but Henry Ford didn't make, or Ford doesn't make Toyota. Toyota doesn't make Mitsubishi, right? So even though there's this, wait, what did I just say? Anyway, who cares? Okay. Even with different makes of Ford, basically, you see the same common things in each, you know? So, okay, these things point to common design. Here's the third thing. I don't know the guy's name. It's Haeckel or Heschel or something like that. But in your textbooks, if you've taken evolutionary biology classes or just biology classes, you'll see these drawings of fetuses, which are early stages of human development or any creature's development, and he puts them beside one another, and he shows in it the similarities. And his drawings are still in textbooks. They still, get represented, even though those drawings have been proved to be fraudulent. Basically, that he overemphasized his drawings to prove his point. Okay? To prove that these things have similar, so he made it look more so and more convincing to people. And when he first did it, people jumped on the bandwagon because they're like, yeah, good point, man, evolution. We're grasping for straws here. Thanks a lot, man, for getting that. So through that, even though it's been shown fraudulent that he drew and misinterpreted it all, it still passes and still is shown as like a breakthrough in science. But that leads into the next thing. So when you see stuff like that, think common design. That just proves that it's coming from the same one who created this, and he puts his fingerprints on it, and you can see common design in it. Number 9 is this, and this one's I'm going to try to go through this quickly, but it's this: don't believe everything in your textbooks. Please do investigation on your own. Don't believe everything I say. Be like, okay, Lee, that's cool. I'll go check it out. Please do that. That'd be great. So I pointed out this. His drawings were proven fraudulent. The second thing is this: the Miller experiment. It was in 1953, where basically he made this environment that was supposed to be like the early, the beginning of time environment, basically. And in that environment, he produced amino acids, which are what they call the building blocks of life, okay? And that's like a breakthrough in science. Well, nowadays, since we've, been advanced more in technology and we know a little bit more, most scientists say that experiment was whack. That his environment was not really the environment of the early age of the earth, or of the early earth. They say that it was the wrong atmosphere for the beginning, and that's a consensus of scientists that say that. And they say that if he were to experiment or do that experiment in the thought to be environment of the early earth, you would get some really bad chemicals that would not produce life, but really death. Basically, look it up, please. The Miller experiment, look it up. Here's another one. The reason I mention that is because it's still in textbooks. Even though you see scientists kind of going, throwing that idea out. Yeah, it was a good idea back in the day, but we're past that now. There's new information that's been shed light on. But for us, we read it and we're like, oh wow, that's evidence for evolution, man. Gosh. Don't believe everything that you read in textbook. And please read the fine print in your textbook. And please see how much liberty they take in their drawings and in their webs and in everything. Just see the liberty that they take. And the third thing is this: Darwin's tree of life. We've all seen it. coming from one, and breaking and dividing and things like that. So you see this tree of life. Basically, we know now, and Darwin wrote in his book, I've heard this several times, that Darwin said this, that if the fossil record didn't prove it, like at the moment, the fossil record had never proved that Darwin was right. There were still missing, they call it missing links. That's why you always hear people talking about the missing link and like, hey, we finally found the missing link, because this is like the one thing that scientists are searching for so that they can prove Darwin was right about, common descent. However, in the fossil record, we see this thing, you ready? It's called the Cambrian explosion. It's basically an empty space in the fossil record. We see these organisms, these early formed organisms, and then we see, a little bit of progression, but then we see in the middle this break where you don't see any fossil records, and then at the top you see basically new ones. And so they say Darwin's theory was that these ones came from these ones, though we don't have the evidence right now. Future studies will show that. But still to this day, future studies haven't shown that. So the missing link is still missing. Now there's always hubbub and fuss about, oh, well, we just found this. But then it's investigated and shown to be not true or not exactly what they thought it would be, because they're grasping for straws, basically. They're grasping for life and trying to hold on to things, trying to prove this thing. So the fossil record still doesn't support Darwin's tree. And Darwin actually stated this, that it would be proven wrong if those fossils were not found. I don't have the exact quote. I'm sure I could find it for you guys, but I probably should have done my homework on that. But here's the next thing. The Archaeopteryx, basically that's the lizard/bird that you've probably heard about, being the missing link and like showing that. That's one case. Basically, most scientists believe that this was not a mix between the two, but it was really just an ancient bird that is now extinct, whose line is now extinct. So even that has been kind of shoved away. But still we see it. Still we see it coming in our face and being brought up in conversation and things like that. But that's the last one, is don't believe, not the last one, that's the ninth one, is don't believe everything in your textbooks. Study it, investigate it yourself. Look into the evidence. And really be investigative reporters yourself. Look at these things. All right. So those are the 10 things. If you guys want the 10 things, you can go to Faith, because she's awesome. Okay, those are the 9 things so far. I'm going to give you the 10th, okay, Faith? And I'm telling everybody to go to you if they want them, okay? So just be prepared to have a lot of friends, okay? These things are all good to know whenever somebody comes at you, because most of the time when people come to Christians, we don't really know our stuff. And we're like, well, just because God says it. Yes, that's true. God did say it, and I believe what God said, and that pretty much settles it. But for these people, let's have intelligent conversation with them. Let's speak to them about these things. Let's say, hey, man, I don't totally disagree with, natural selection. Like, I definitely see that. I'm not dumb. Whenever you say, like, evolution's dumb, what some people actually think is that you're saying science is dumb, because they don't know any other thing than what they've been taught. So why is that first point important? It's because not only do you need to know that, but other people need to know that. And you need to be like, hey, actually, you're looking at the evidence through a naturalistic worldview, saying that there is no God, which we talked about was contradictory, and you can even say that to them. You don't have to be mean about it, but know your stuff and talk about these things. And don't let things slide by. And be like, well, and if you don't know something, be like, I'm not sure about that. I'll go look at it and bring you an article or anything like that you want, and we'll talk about it more. You don't have to know all the answers, but this is a good, helpful thing. I think these are 10 important things. The last one is this. This is the one I want you guys to leave with, and I've already told you, is that you're not alone. The secularist, the Naturalists would have you to believe that belief in God is medieval, that anyone who is rational and studied, who's went to university or intelligent, cannot seriously believe in God. And you'll hear the new atheists really push this, like people who are like, there is no God, you're dumb, and they use really mean language and stuff like that, and it's like, and you start to feel like intimidated. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm dumb. Guys, all they're doing is throwing out, they call them ad hominems, like they're just name calling. And yeah, that can be intimidating sometimes. But if you know your stuff and know these things, you're not dumb. You've thought about these things. You know why you believe what you believe. If you don't know why you believe what you believe, please don't fuel them. But yeah, man, I met a Christian the other day who was just talking out of his butt. What I want you guys to do is get in conversation with them, and I want them to realize that they're talking out of their butt from their preconceived ideas. And I want you to go out there and change the world. That's why this is important, because this kind of dominates our society. Kinda. Listen to this. In Francis Collins' book, he points out this point, that 40%, a survey was given in 1970 and sometime in 1999 or 2000 or maybe 2007 actually, I'm not sure, but in a 30-year or 40-year span of time, this number didn't change of a poll that was given to scientists. And the question that was asked was this: do you believe in a God, basically who's personable, who answers prayers? And 40% of scientists said yes. And this was kind of the premise of Francis Collins' book that he wrote about the human genome and about the fingerprints of God. And what secularists and naturalists and the new atheists wouldn't want you to know. They want you to think that you're secluded, that you're alone, that there's nobody who's rational on your side. But that's not the case. That's why I think it's important to throw out Francis Collins' name, as well as other guys' names. But you're not alone. 40% of scientists believe in a God who answers prayers, in a personal God. That's a pretty direct, theism. That's not just deism, as in oh yeah, I believe that God made everything and then left it to be. Because deists even believe in evolution to some extent. A lot of them do. Because they believe that God just put that single organism and evolution started doing its work. And they're like, well, God did that. But 40% of scientists believe that. There is a God who answers prayers, and that God is actively involved in this world. 40%. By no means are we a dying population. By no means is this dumb, but it's actually smart. We stand with 4 out of 10. That's a good number. It's not dying. It's actually stayed the same in that long of time. So that's the last thing that you guys should know.